At the T-minus 3-minute mark, tape recorders on board the spacecraft were turned on. These recorders record both voice and data. We have ignition decommissioned. The engine is now building up to 7.7 million pounds of thrust. We have a launch commit and we have a liftoff. Moving back. The Saturn V lifting off the power.
This is WOMMLP operating out of Burlington, Vermont. 105.9 The Radiator is once again at the Rocket Shop. I'm your host, Tom Proctor. With me tonight is Gahlord Dewald. How's it going?
Going well. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Anytime. Now, you're a little bit of an interesting artist, a bit different to what we usually expect. So we usually start off with a song, or I don't know if I'd describe it as a song in this kind of instance. But would you like to introduce maybe kind of what your genre is?
Yeah.
The piece that you'll be playing, and then the song itself, and then
Sure.
take it away.
Sure. So I'm a free improvisation bassist. I do a bunch of other kinds of things too, but today that's the thing I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to play some music for a little while, and then we'll talk about it.
Sweet.
All right.
Take it away.
And then I'm done.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so as I said, very different. Your genre is incredibly difficult to pin down. So how do you describe yourself to others?
Yeah. So that's a good question. I usually just say that I play music and it's improvised. If I'm talking to other super music nerds, I'll be like, well, it's free improvisation and non-idiomatic in the same vein as Eric Bailey in the 60s or whatever. And people have been making this kind of music for a long time. But generally just say I play music and I make it up as I go. Right? That's like the simplest way to think of it is I start with the instrument and I think about some directions maybe or contrasts that I want to work with and go from there. I think each improviser is kind of usually approaches it in their own way, and some people are more excited about technical aspects of playing, how many notes they can fit in or those kinds of things, or others are more concerned with the nature of sound itself. Like that's something I get into, like I play the double bass, which is like the cello but more, and like I get excited about what do those really low frequencies sound like, or how do they feel, or what is the sound of the wood or the sound of your fingers on the strings, just like the tactile physical nature of sound, which isn't so different from having an electric guitar cranked up to 11 where you feel the sound itself. It's just a different expression of that.
And so you say it's improvisational. The two of the genres that kind of come to mind when you say that is jam and jazz. Jazz being, kind of the basis of the rest of the music we have these days. So, especially jazz, how does it differ to that kind of form of music?
Well, I think a lot of the players who do free improvisation, many of them would, I think, trace sort of their history or their thinking back to jazz. Like I play in a jazz quartet that does, quote unquote normal jazz or standards jazz. The difference might be like like say you're playing Coltrane songs or something. Like a standard jazz band is essentially a cover band, right? Instead of covering the Grateful Dead, you're covering Miles Davis and John Coltrane or Charlie Parker or any of these other fantastic musicians. And there are structures in place for those songs. So if you're going to play My Favorite Things, it has a specific set of chords and melodies, and that's what makes it what it is. And there's moments within those structures where you can make it up as you go. And though even within, there's some limits perhaps on that, and people argue about this all the time, but there's like a structure, and you play the melody, and then you make it up as you go for a little while, and then you play the melody. And that would be the normal format for like a jazz thing. If you go down to the Deli 126 on Friday, you can hear me and my quartet do that. Whereas free improvisation, the free part of it comes from we don't start with a set of chord changes or a known melody. We start from silence, and we play from there and make it up as we go, and maybe we return to things, or maybe we just continually push forward through something, but it doesn't have a structure to it in the way that a traditional, jazz arrangement might.
And for you, do you class this because it's a non-traditional song? Do you class it as it's like pure art? Is it just sonic art like you would find in a contemporary art museum? Do you class this as music? Is this a Venn diagram of several different things?
Probably a Venn. I haven't really thought of it that way, but like a Venn diagram probably would work out to some degree. It's obviously music, and I've got a very broad definition for music is like sound that human beings organize qualifies as music. So while you're jackhammering on the street, if you're the jackhammerist and you're doing that and organizing the sounds, then you're the jackhammerist. So it's definitely music. We're definitely organizing the sounds and making decisions about them and how we feel about the sound and that kind of thing. Although when you mention contemporary art, sometimes I will describe the genre as like, it's like contemporary art, but for sound. And within these sort of edge case musics where you have maybe free improvisation or contemporary composition and stuff written by living composers that may or may not be quote unquote classical, but it's living composers. And then experimental music, kind of those three sort of triangle of sounds out there. It's really about exploring. It's about exploring what's available to us for expression as humans, but also exploring the physics of sound. Like there's a bunch of things that are going on there, and it's definitely music. It may not be a song in the same sort of product-oriented thing that it may not easily fit into if we still had things called record stores, except Greg's store up in Winooski notwithstanding, even though they might not fit into a bin very easily, it's still a kind of expression.
And what are you trying to, and I'm sure this changes from piece to piece, but what is it that you broadly try and invoke when someone comes and listens to you play?
The main things I'm personally working on, in a show, is I'm really into exploring the raw tone of the instrument itself. Like when I'm playing the double bass, just letting people be in the room with that sound for a while. Like I'm trying to build space for people to either self-reflect or just to exist for a little while, just to rest and exist for a little while, which we don't we aren't often encouraged to do. We're often encouraged to, click next, listen to the next thing, go to the next thing. Like there is no rest, left in the world. And I'm trying to create a space where that's possible, I guess. And using music as the sort of device for that exploration. Yeah, I guess that's what I would say about that.
No, I like that. Well, I feel that maybe we should pause and take a rest and have a listen now.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was doing a little bit of reading online from your website, and you're gracious enough to bring this beautiful double bass in with you tonight. And you did mention on that site that this double bass is your foundation for the songs that you do create. And I don't know how many are fully improvised when you do record them. I'm sure there's probably a little bit more.
It's a little of both. Yeah, it's a little of both. many of the recordings that are on like Bandcamp, a bunch of those are improvisations, or they're improvisations. And sometimes there are sort of repeating themes that we go back and forth with. A guy that I studied with for a while and who had this bass before me, Bar Phillips, explained to me once. He says, free improvisers it's kind of like you have one song and you're just playing it over and over, and some days it's a little different than it was, and you're just constantly refining it. And that was kind of an interesting way of thinking about it, where it's not like it's all really, it's all just the same song, really. But it changes, or you're feeling it differently on some days than others, and different features of it come out at different times. That said, I do play some stuff that have notes on a page, and I've commissioned composers. I've got 10 pieces that I've commissioned from different composers around the country for the double bass, using some of the kind of special techniques that I know how to do, and those kinds of things. So I try to be involved sort of in all of the different kind of generative or quote unquote creative musics, where trying to encourage other people to make new works for the double bass, because we don't have a lot of like concert pieces for the bass. There's lots for the cello and the violin, but double bass we've got a couple, and they're great, but we could use more. So so I do that stuff too.
And you did mention, as I said, that you kind of built your double bass is your foundation. So what do you then build around that, and how do you build around that? What's your process in general?
Yeah, so when I'm working with just a double bass, I'm really tuning in as much as I can just to the raw physical sensation of the sound itself. Like, we can hear a note and say, oh, that's a note, that's nice. But like to really get microscopic with it, except I guess with my ears, so micro-earic with it. I don't know what that would be. Micro-auric? I don't know. But really paying attention to what is the nature of that sound. Like how is the sound of a low E different on a double bass than it is on a piano, for example? And like what's the difference between those sounds? And so I try to listen in for that, like what is the nature of the sound, and what is the nature of the sound today? Because just like with any sort of physical endeavor, like athletics or whatever, the day, in any given moment, your body's going to be responding different, the instrument's going to be responding different, the room is going to be responding, like all those things respond differently. And to really be open to how sound is influencing and being influenced by all of those things together, which gets this, sounds a little bit like hippie Vermont stuff after a while, but it's true. It's like anyone who's been on stage, when you play a note into the room, you can tell like, where's the audience at right now? Like, are they receiving this or not? Are they interested or not? Like when I was playing, to begin with, and people were moving around, and then after a little while, they're really, really quiet, and then feeling that, what's the shift in that, and trying to work with all of those things kind of together. It's really about paying attention as much as possible to everything that's happening, both within my control on the instrument, but also in the room itself.
And I did read an interesting piece about your performance at Waking Windows, where you played in a coffee shop quite early in the day. And you mentioned how different that was in terms of the way people react.
Yeah. So we have a I think that might have been about the AM Frequency series, where we have it's me, Community of Sound, kind of my collective of experimenters, and Karma Birdhouse and Maglianero, where we do a show at 7:30 in the morning on a weekday of music not unlike what we've just heard on the radio, or with giant tape loops or different things like that. And the context in which we listen to music has an influence on how it gets to us, right? And we know that, like I know that from like being a kid and walking around and listening to songs when like I've got a broken heart that has a different, the certain albums really like I could still feel the way I did when I was a teenager, and or where we were when we heard certain kinds of sounds. And part of that, the goal of that 7:30 in the morning series is to experience new sounds before you've quite woken up, where it's like in a different context, like on the way to work, perhaps, as sort of one element of it, or just not at night at a bar, for example. Like hearing music not at a bar changes the context of kind of the meaning of all of that, and it I feel allows people a chance to kind of reflect on the sounds or themselves or their day or any number of things.
Did you find an interesting reaction to that? Because I know the Calm Bird House is it's a commercial office building with a lot of creative types in it.
Yeah.
But 7:30 in the morning,
right?
Experimental music is certainly not something you would really expect to hear on your way into work.
Yeah, and that we're really lucky that they're open to that idea of like let's give this a try. I mean, on the one hand, it's lucky that it's 7:30 to 9:30. So if you want to start at 9, it's probably just a half an hour of this sort of thing. But what I've found, and we've been doing it every month so far this year, there are a few people that come to hear it specifically to hear it, and that sort of speaks to like one of the other goals of that series was accessibility, where some people can't make shows in the evening because either they work or they have family commitments and that kind of thing. And so there are several people who come and bring their newborns or kids, stuff like that, and just to hear the music. And then there are some people who are just popping in to get their coffee and their day just got a little bit weird. And that's always fantastic to see the kind of what happens to their face as they walk in and they're like, what is happening? And then they're waiting for coffee and they're like into it. And then they get their coffee and they go to work because that's what they're doing. And then since it's a coffee shop where people also work, like some people show up and they set up their laptops and they realize, oh, something's a little different today. And they carry on doing their business as normal, and that's that. And I've always kind of wondered about that crew kind of most of all, where it's like, oh, geez, I hope they're not too put out that like we're doing this weird thing. But after our last show, I got done, and a woman looks up from her laptop, and she says, "Thank you so much." And I was like, oh, that's good. That's what I want. That's what I want is just a little bit of extra something in the day, and let that experience happen. No one's thrown rocks or bricks or anything yet. So far we've been pretty good with
Hot
it.
coffee has not come your way.
Right. It comes to us, but it's in a mug and it tastes fantastic. So.
And you mentioned there your collective that you created. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Community of Sound is a experimental music incubator, and we started last May, so it's going to be a year old here very shortly. And we run a series called the Cosine Series, which stands for Community of Sound, Improvised, New, and Experimental. And we bring in people from out of town that I know through my contemporary music networks. We've had Rajna Swaminathan, who's just releasing a new album. You can read about it in The Wire. We've had Sandy Ewan, who's an experimental prepared guitar player, does a ton of fantastic work. We're about to have Elizabeth A. Baker for a week in a couple weeks from the 13th to the 17th, and she does a bunch of electronics, and we're going to have a Women in Technology workshop while she's here, so we're really excited about that. But in addition to the series, we also use our space to create our own work. So it's kind of like it's not so much like a shared band space, so much as like a production space where we work, and we've got a lot of recording gear and a baby grand piano and stuff and enough space to work, which in Burlington is a real challenge for musicians. I think probably every musician in town is kind of aware of, most people's apartment leases say you can't practice, stuff like that. So just having a space that's dedicated to the pursuit of sound in a very welcoming and diverse crew of people is, that's something that's important to us to kind of like make that happen. And there's 7 of us. And so we basically hang out and make music. We check out the space, or we sometimes do things as a group together, or little groups, or some of us have bands and practice there. One of our very prolific members. Adrian Cooper Smith is almost always recording either a folk band or a metal band. There's always something crazy happening. I walk in, I'm like, all right, Adrian, you know.
It's a little bit like this place.
It's a lot like this place, and in fact, it's like upstairs from this place. So you know, we should have a joint mic locker or something.
That'd be wonderful.
But that's the group, and we're constantly kind of looking for additional things to work on and collaborations. We're going to be curating a stage at Waking Windows that we just found out about, so we're excited to be sort of holding down the fort for the weird music on Waking Windows Friday night. So if you want to hear more of this, and we're really lucky, like Burlington we have a lot of really creative music. Like I started keeping track of it over the course of the year and like writing down like who's doing what where. And there's all the different DIY shows, like out at the Gloom Garden is always doing a cool noise show or something like that. And we've got our own series, or, you know, Lauren, OUZKXQLZN is constantly doing something interesting, like her Yoko Ono tribute night that she did. That was an amazing show. So it's my friends from Brooklyn will be like, well, what's the scene for experimental music like up in Burlington? Like, how could there be anything? And I'm like, well, I'll put on a show and there'll be 10 to 15 people will come. And, you know, if I haul all of my gear down to Brooklyn and I play a show, 10 to 15 people will come. So our scene is every bit as vibrant as Brooklyn.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, more people per capita.
more people per capita as well. Exactly. And once you get beyond that, if you get out to like Montpelier, then there's a group called Turn Music that does a bunch of fantastic classical pieces. Last year, they did this great song cycle by Sarah K. Snyder called Penelope, and it was for chamber ensemble plus laptop electronics, and I performed the electronics part, but it was, you know, a fantastic thing. It's like we really, like in most things, you know, Vermont punches above its weight in cool stuff, and I'm really excited to be a part of that.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear another song.
Sure thing.
Some time. Thank you very much, Gaylord.
Thanks for having me.
That was wonderful. Before you go, is there anything you'd like to plug? Any events you got on?
Oh man, there's a bunch. Well, I guess go to Gahlord Dewald, GAHLORD, DEWALD.com. Get on the email list because I email list people about all the cool stuff going on, and not just my own, but everything that everyone's doing. Upcoming most immediately on Sunday at 2:30 p.m. at the Community Sound Space, which is just upstairs from here at Fort Howard. There is a ambient electroacoustic trio of modular synth, keyboard and laptop electronics, and saxophone that's playing as part of our Cosine series. And then that April 13th to 17th, when we have Elizabeth A. Baker in town, especially that Sunday, we're going to do the Women in Technology workshop. So if anybody who's female or female identifying wants to do a class of music technology stuff and not have a bunch of bros there, that's a great time to do it. For those of us who are not women, she's going to do one on Monday for everybody, for women and not women. So no one's left out. We're just going to have a special class for women. So those are things I would really encourage people to check out.
Oh, wicked. Well, once again, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.
Do appreciate it. Coming up next, we've got Homebrew. We'll be right back.